Over the last week or so, a lot of people have commented, "Oh, Father, you've got a busy week ahead." And yes, it's true, Holy Week has a lot of activity here at church, both observable, such as the various masses and other liturgies, and sometimes not so observable activities, the preparations for everything involved. And at the same time, though, my response to that comment has usually been, it's the greatest week of the year. And it certainly is. Without Holy Week, without the celebrations of Jesus' Last Supper, death, and resurrection, none of the rest of the year really makes sense. As St. Paul said to the Corinthians, if Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain. In other words, the resurrection gives meaning to everything else that we do and is the centerpiece of our faith in Jesus. We see tonight this celebration of the resurrection as the high point of this most important week. Our hearts are filled with joy knowing that our Savior lives and has conquered death. We know that He has vanquished sin and overcome the terror of evil. Tonight we heard 7 readings from the Old Testament. Now, I know that makes for a long night. But going through all those readings is meant to take us through the history leading up to the coming of Jesus and help us to see how all of God's history with His people was building toward the coming of His Son, who would die for us and rise for us. We heard how God created the first people, the promise He made to Abraham and his descendants, how God freed His people from slavery in Egypt. We then heard from some of the prophets that God sent to the people to remind them of the covenant they were meant to live with Him. 2 readings from Isaiah and 1 each from Baruch and Ezekiel. Those readings serve to remind us that Jesus did not come out of nowhere, but that instead He is the fulfillment of all that God had already been doing. In a similar way, when I look out at the 25 people who will receive sacraments of initiation tonight, those 10 who will be baptized, another 10 who are becoming Catholic, and 5 Catholic adults receiving confirmation, I think about how God has already been active in their lives. It was the grace of God that moved them to seek Him out. It was the grace of God that helped them to come forward, to join the RCIA process, and ultimately seek the sacraments tonight. Just as God's work in the plan of salvation has a long history prior to the resurrection, so also does His work have a history in the lives of those 25 among us tonight. Of course, we also believe that God's intervention in world events did not stop with the resurrection of Jesus. At Mass over the next 50 days, our first reading will often come from the Acts of the Apostles, recounting the actions of the early church in the years shortly after the resurrection. Along those lines, God will not stop working in the lives of those who are baptized or confirmed tonight. He will continue to invite them to know Him better, to receive Him in the Eucharist, to have their sins forgiven in sacramental reconciliation, and to share His good news with the wider world. It's also true that God never stops working in any of us. Holy Week is the greatest week of the year. It celebrates the greatest events of our faith, and it's something we should look forward to every year. At the same time, throughout the year, God invites us to know Him, to love Him, and to serve Him more fully. Happy Easter.